Mr. Culver, that structure is not compliant with community standards. You have 30 days. That was Diane Wexler, standing at the end of my driveway on a Tuesday morning in early October, holding a clipboard like it was a badge of appointment. She was president of the Hollis Bend Neighborhood Association, had been for 9 years, and she had driven up in a white SUV with a vanity plate to inform me that the cedar-sided workshop I had built with a city permit in 2007 was, in her words, a problem. Behind her, the Missouri Riverbend sky was going gray, and the leaves on the sycamores along the road were just starting to turn. She had on pressed khakis and a blazer the color of a new fire extinguisher, and she stood on my gravel driveway like she owned the air above it. What Diane did not know, and never once thought to verify, was that my property deed predated her association's recorded covenants by 11 years and 143 days. She had no jurisdiction over my lot. Not one line of her covenant applied to me. I knew that the morning her first letter arrived, because I had already spent an hour at the county recorder's office before I bothered to return her call. She had no idea. I want to ask you something right now, because I have thought about it 100 times since. If someone walked up to your driveway with a clipboard and a 30-day notice, telling you a structure you had a clean city permit on was coming down, would you have written a check just to make them go away? Or would you have walked inside and started a folder? Because I started a folder. And that folder, 4 years later and 3 inches thick, would end a demolition order in 19 minutes at a city council table. My name is Ray Culver. I was 54 years old when Diane walked up that driveway, 58 now. I spent 31 years as a licensed commercial electrician, running my own one-man shop out of a rented bay on the east side of Hollis Bend, Missouri, a riverbend town of about 8,000 people, wedged between 2 county roads and a grain elevator you can see from the highway. I own a 0.4-acre lot on Sycamore Lane, and on that lot, near the back property line, there sits a 24 by 32-foot cedar-sided workshop that I built in the spring and summer of 2007. I pulled the permit myself, paid the inspection fee myself, had the structure inspected by the city 3 separate times, and picked up the final certificate of occupancy on March 14th, 2007. That certificate has lived in a fireproof lockbox in my bedroom closet ever since. The reason I kept it there instead of in a drawer was not paranoia. It had to do with Doreen. My wife, Doreen, passed 4 years before Diane came to my driveway. Pancreatic cancer, fast and mean, 14 months from the first scan to the end. The summer she got sick was the summer we finally put the cedar trim on the workshop. We had been planning to finish it for 2 years, kept putting it off the way people do when they imagine time stretching ahead of them without limit. That summer we had no illusions about time. Our daughter Mara was 12 years old, and she helped us measure and cut and nail. The 3 of us worked through 3 weeks of Missouri August heat, and Doreen stood on the back porch with a glass of lemonade and called out whenever our lines went crooked. She had a good eye. Better than mine, honestly. That workshop is the last large thing we built as a family, and the cedar on its south wall still looks as clean as the day we put it up. So when I say I kept the permit in a fireproof box, I want you to understand what I mean. Some documents carry more than their legal weight. Mara was 16 when this story found its stride, living with me full-time since her mother died. Sharp and stubborn in a way that still catches me off guard sometimes because it is so completely Doreen. The autumn Diane came to the driveway was a school day morning, and Mara was at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal and her geometry homework when I came back inside, holding Diane's first letter. Mara looked up and asked, "Is she allowed to do that?" I set the letter on the table and told her I did not think so, but we were going to find out. Mara pushed her cereal aside and went to her backpack. She pulled out a manila folder and wrote HOA Wexler on the tab in permanent marker, her handwriting blocky and deliberate, and she set it on the table in front of me. That was the beginning of the binder. That folder lived on the kitchen table for the next week and in a file box on my desk for the next 4 years. I want to say something about documentation before this story goes further, because it is what the whole thing rests on. I learned the habit the hard way, about 6 years into running my own shop. A disputed change order on a commercial retrofit job cost me 11 weeks of argument and $3,000 I never recovered. Because the verbal agreement I thought we had was the only agreement I had. After that, I kept a daily log on every job. Date, site address, who was present, every decision made, who made it, how it was communicated. If it was a phone call, I wrote down the time and what was said and initialed the page. If it was a text, I printed it. I did not keep records because I distrusted everyone around me. I kept records because I had learned that the world does not reward the man who was right in the moment. It rewards the man who can show he was right on page 6 of a dated log. What Diane Wexler was about to discover over 4 long years was that I had been that man for a very long time before she ever drove up my driveway. The Hollis Bend Neighborhood Association had been founded in 2018. Its covenants were recorded with the county on August 3rd of that year. My property deed was recorded in 2004 when I bought the lot. My workshop permit was issued in 2007. When the association formed in 2018 and began recruiting members, their board sent a letter inviting existing property owners to sign on to the covenants. I received one of those letters in the spring of 2019. I read through the document carefully, noted that several of the aesthetic requirements would conflict with the commercial nature of my workshop, and declined in writing. I sent my refusal by certified mail and kept the return receipt card in the lockbox with my permit. None of this was contested at the time. The board acknowledged my response with a form letter saying they were sorry I would not be participating. That was the last communication from the association for 2.5 years, until Diane walked up my driveway. She had apparently decided that my prior refusal was a detail rather than a legal position. The fine notices began arriving 6 weeks after her visit. $200 a month for what the letters described as aesthetic non-compliance with community standards. She sent 14 of them over the following 14 months. I filed each one in the folder without writing a check. After the 3rd notice, I wrote a single response letter, sent certified mail laying out my deed date of 2004, the covenant recording date of August 2018, the fact that I had declined to sign onto the covenants in 2019, and the plain consequence that her association held no jurisdiction over my property. I included the county recorder's filing numbers for the deed and the covenant document so that anyone who wanted to verify it could do so in about 20 minutes. Her response arrived 4 days later, hand-delivered by a board member in a white Land Rover. And it was a 5th fine notice with a handwritten note at the bottom saying I was not in compliance and further penalties would accrue. That went in the folder alongside the others. 14 notices sent, $0 collected. Hold that number because it will come back around. The 2nd year opened with a knock on my front door one Wednesday afternoon in March. A man stood on the porch wearing a tan vest with what appeared to be a city seal embroidered on the chest and carrying a metal clipboard. He introduced himself as a technician from the City Code Compliance Office and said he had received a complaint about the foundation setback and electrical installation of my workshop shed. He asked to come around to the back of the property for a look. I told him I would be happy to walk him back there. But first I needed to see his city employee identification. He reached into the front pocket of his vest and produced a laminated card in a clear plastic sleeve. The card had his photo on it and a printed name. T. Halverson, Code Compliance Technician, City of Hollis Bend. I asked to hold it. He hesitated for a moment and then handed it to me. I took a photograph of the card with my phone, both sides, before I gave it back. Then I took out my phone again, dialed the city code office number from memory, and put the call on speaker on my own front porch. The woman who answered confirmed she was the Code Compliance Department. I asked her to check whether a T. Halverson was on their staff. She put me on hold for less than a minute. When she came back, she said they had no employee by that name, active or former. I thanked her and ended the call. The man in the vest was already stepping back toward the sidewalk. He moved quickly for someone who had been projecting official authority 30 seconds earlier. He had parked a black half-ton pickup at the curb, and the magnetic signs on the doors read, Wexler Property Group. I photographed the truck before he drove away. I photographed his plate. Mara had been watching from the kitchen window the entire time and had already written the plate number on the back of an envelope. I spent 3 evenings that week at the county planning office, going through permit applications and zoning submissions in the Hollis Bend file. What I found, in a preliminary site plan submitted 18 months earlier, was a proposed connector road that ran along the south edge of my lot line. The road would link 2 parcels that Wexler Property Group had quietly acquired over the prior 2 years to a planned 12-unit riverfront condominium development 2 blocks to the east, on a stretch of the river that had been underutilized for decades. My lot sat at the inside of a turn in the route the road needed to take. The right-of-way the plan required overlapped my south fence line by 14 feet. My workshop sat 12 feet from that fence line. Diane Wexler was the HOA president. Court Wexler was her husband and ran Wexler Property Group. The workshop was not the problem. It was the excuse. The real problem, from Court's side, was that I had not sold them a strip of my property and was not planning to. The fine letters and the fake inspector were the opening moves in a pressure campaign designed to make me either sell or comply on terms that would give them what they needed. I did not call Diane. I did not knock on Court's office door. I filed everything I had found, including the site plan and the Wexler name connection, in a new labeled section of the folder. Then I called Beth Soren. Beth is a title attorney who runs a small practice on Mill Street, and I had used her when I bought my lot in 2004. She knew my deed better than I did. I told her what I had found and read her the county recorder numbers on the covenant document. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Ray, your lot predates their covenants by 11 years. They have nothing." She said she would pull the documents herself and put her confirmation in writing. 2 weeks later, her letter arrived. 2 pages, citing the exact recording dates and the legal conclusion that the association's covenants had no applicability to my property. I put the letter in the folder. Beth also mentioned, almost as an aside at the end of a phone call, that the building on Mill Street where Diane held her HOA board meetings was a parcel she understood was being held by a private owner who had been considering a sale. I thanked her and tucked that thought into a back corner of my mind. I was not ready for it yet. In the 3rd year, 2 of my longest-standing electrical clients called me within 8 days of each other. The first was Ed Pryor, who ran a commercial laundry operation on the north side of town and had used my shop for 10 years. He called on a Tuesday afternoon, uncomfortable and apologetic, and told me a woman had called his office identifying herself as a representative of the neighborhood association, and told him I was under active code violation proceedings that could result in the suspension of my contractor's license. He wanted me to know before he heard it from someone else. The second call was from Dale Whitman, who owned a small precision machine shop and had been a steady customer since I started on my own. Same story, nearly the same words. I asked both of them to write down exactly what was said, as precisely as they could remember it, sign the statement, and mail it to me. Both men did so within a week. Their signed statements went in the folder. Diane had now contacted my clients. That was the fourth step on the staircase, and it was the first one that made my jaw tighten in a way I had to consciously settle before I picked up the phone. 3 weeks after Dale Whitman's call, a registered letter arrived from an attorney in Springfield. The HOA was filing a civil suit in county court claiming that my workshop encroached on a common area easement running along my south property line. An easement it alleged had been established by common use and practice over the years since the association was formed. I went to the lockbox and pulled my original title search, which Beth had prepared in 2004 when I bought the property. There was no easement of any kind listed in that document. Not a utility easement, not a drainage easement, not a common area notation of any description. I sent a copy of the title search to Beth along with the lawsuit filing and called her that afternoon. She read it and said, "This is going to cost them." I asked her to elaborate. She explained that a civil filing opens discovery on both sides, and that the association would be required to produce its own records, its financial accounts, and its communications in response to a discovery request. She said she would prepare the response and begin drafting discovery demands. That was escalation 5. That summer, on a Sunday afternoon in late June, my phone rang. It was Gus Ferris. Gus was Doreen's uncle on her mother's side. 79 years old that year, a quiet man who had made his money in rural Missouri commercial real estate over several decades and had never made much noise about it. He said he was starting to thin out his holdings because his health was not what it had been, and he wanted to offer me first look at something before he listed it. Gus owned a 1.1-acre commercial parcel on Mill Street, which had been in his portfolio for nearly 20 years. The parcel held a strip mall-style building with 5 tenant suites. Among those tenants, on a month-to-month lease with no renewal clause, were the Hollis Bend Neighborhood Association, which used 1 suite for its office and board meetings, and Wexler Property Group, which maintained a satellite office in an adjacent suite. Gus had no particular knowledge of my situation with them. He was offering the parcel to me because Doreen had been his favorite niece, because I had taken care of a few electrical issues in his buildings over the years on a handshake and a reasonable invoice, and because he would rather sell to someone he knew than go through a broker. He named a price. I told him I needed a couple of days. I spent those 2 days running the numbers with my accountant and calling Beth to run the title. I called Gus back on Tuesday morning and told him yes. Beth drew up the purchase agreement that week. The deed closed 60 days later, recorded quietly with the county, no announcement. The tenants on Mill Street received no notice of the ownership change at closing. Their leases were month to month. I had that in writing, confirmed by Gus's leasing records before I signed. I left them exactly where they were. I did not send any letter. I did not say a word to Diane or to court. I simply became their landlord and kept the folder open. Mara figured out what I had done about 2 weeks after closing. She found the deed in the lockbox when she was looking for her birth certificate for a school form, a college prep program application that needed documentation. She came downstairs holding it with both hands, read it once from top to bottom, and then looked across the kitchen table at me in a way that reminded me very much of her mother, working out the answer to a problem she had not been told was a problem. She said, "Dad, that's their office." I told her that was correct. She set the deed down carefully on the table, the way you set down something heavier than it looks, and was quiet for a moment. Then she slid it back toward me. She did not ask what I was going to do with it. She did not ask whether it was fair play or whether it would cause trouble. She already understood, because she had been sitting at that kitchen table for 3 years, watching me build the folder one page at a time. And she knew that every page in that folder was the same kind of move. A week later, I looked through the binder and found a new tab divider near the back, labeled Mill Street in her block handwriting, with the closing date and the parcel number written underneath it. She had filed the deed herself. The winter of the 4th year was quiet on the surface. The civil suit was working through county court at the pace civil suits move in small counties, which is to say slowly, and Beth was making productive use of discovery without requiring much from me directly. She had subpoenaed the association's financial records and its internal communications, and what came back in response over 3 months was, she told me in a phone call, informative. She did not go into detail, but said the documents were being organized. I ran my shop, kept my client's schedule, and kept filing any contact from the association or from Wexler's people in the appropriate section of the binder. 4 more fine notices arrived that winter. Same format, same dollar amount, same legal foundation of nothing. A letter arrived from court's attorney suggesting my property would benefit from a boundary accommodation agreement, which was their phrasing for asking me to deed them the 14-foot strip along my south fence line. I showed it to Beth. She said, "Do not respond. Let them keep going." So I put the letter in the folder and let them keep going. I was not comfortable exactly. I was patient. There is a difference. Comfortable means you are not paying attention. Patient means you have decided what you are waiting for, and you are willing to wait for it. I was waiting for them to commit to something they could not walk back from. They were working up to it. In the early morning of a Thursday in March, my phone rang at 6:15. It was Mara. I had been at a job site on the east side since 5:30 for a switchgear replacement that needed the building off power before business hours. Her voice was controlled in the particular way that told me she was choosing each word deliberately, the same way her mother used to sound when she was managing something difficult. "Dad," she said, "there are 2 men in our backyard. They have surveying equipment. They are driving stakes along the south fence line." I told her to lock both doors, stay inside, and photograph everything through the window. I was home in 11 minutes. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the men and their truck were gone, and 4 orange survey stakes had been driven into the ground along my south fence, and 2 of them were inside my property line by 8 to 12 inches. I pulled all 4 stakes and photographed each hole in the ground before the frost filled it back in. I photographed the stakes themselves. I was at the county sheriff's office with my photographs and a copy of my recorded deed by 8 that morning. Deputy Reeves took my statement at his desk. He looked at the photographs carefully, compared my fence line to the lot dimensions on the deed, and said in a level voice that if the stakes were placed where my photos showed them, someone had entered my property without authorization and driven markers into the ground I owned. He said he would find out who had authorized the survey. He also said something that I have not forgotten. If I had documentation of a pattern of incidents involving the same parties, he would want to see it when things moved forward. I told him I had 3 years and 4 months of documentation, organized by date. Deputy Reeves called me 3 days later. The survey had been commissioned by Wexler Property Group. The company had no recorded right of entry to my property, no easement, no authorization of any kind. He filed a criminal trespass complaint against the company and submitted it to the county prosecutor's office. 2 weeks after that, a formal demolition order arrived at my door by certified mail. It came from the City of Hollis Bend Code Compliance Office. It cited a complaint affidavit, signed by 3 named neighbors, alleging that my workshop had been constructed without a valid permit and posed a structural hazard to adjacent properties. The order gave me 60 days to remove the structure voluntarily. After that, the city would hire a contractor and place a lien on my property for the cost. I sat at the kitchen table and read it twice while my coffee went cold. Then I went upstairs to the lockbox. I came back to the table with the original 2007 permit, the 3 inspection sign-off forms, and the final certificate of occupancy. I laid them out in order. I photographed each one. Then I sent the photographs to Beth, along with a single question. The affidavit names 3 neighbors. Find out if any of them signed it. Beth had answers in 4 days. She started with the first name on the affidavit, a man named Dale Ostroff, who lived 2 houses north of me on Sycamore Lane. Dale called her office himself before she had finished drafting the inquiry letter, because he had received his own copy of the demolition order as a courtesy notice, and had seen his name on it and knew he had never signed anything. He had never spoken to anyone from the code office about my shed. He had never complained about it to anyone, in writing or otherwise. He came into Beth's office and signed a sworn statement to that effect. The second neighbor, Carol Fenwick, who lived on the East Cross Street and whose property backed partially up to mine, told Beth by phone that she had also not signed, had never been approached, and would come in to sign a statement. The third name was a man who had sold his house on Sycamore Lane 2 years earlier and moved to Tennessee. Beth noted that 2 forged signatures were more than sufficient. She compiled everything she had: Dale Ostroff's sworn statement, Carol Fenwick's sworn statement, my original permit and 3 inspection records, the covenant predating deed analysis from 2 years earlier, and a certified copy of the recorded deed to the Mill Street parcel with my name on it as owner. She called me the evening before the city council meeting where the demolition order was scheduled for formal ratification. She said, "Bring the binder, every page. The Hollis Bend City Council meets on the 2nd Thursday of each month in a wood-paneled room on the ground floor of City Hall that holds about 80 seats when they set up the extra folding chairs, which they had done for that night." The agenda item was listed on the posted notice as Ratification of Code Compliance Order 2024-117, Culver Property, 14 Sycamore Lane. I arrived 15 minutes before the session and took a seat in the front row. Beth was beside me to my left, with her briefcase open and a notepad on her knee. The binder was on the seat to my right, closed, 3 1/4 inches of tab-divided paper. The room filled over the next 15 minutes to somewhere around 60 people, which is more than a typical council night draws, and I did not need to look around to understand why most of them were there. I heard Diane's voice behind me before I saw her, something brisk to someone at the door, and then she was in the second row, 4 feet back, cream blazer, clipboard on her lap, reading something on her phone. Court settled in 2 seats to her right in a navy polo shirt. He did not acknowledge me. Deputy Reeves was standing along the left wall in his tan uniform with his arms at his sides, and he gave me a small nod when I caught his eye. Mara was in the very back row with her spiral notebook open on her knee and a pen in her hand. Council Chair Margaret Aldis called the room to order at 7 o'clock and moved through the early items briskly. When she reached the demolition order, she read the item number and address into the record and asked if there were parties present who wished to speak before the board deliberated. Diane stood up before Margaret had finished the sentence. She spoke for 4 minutes about community standards, the city's obligation to enforce its codes, the history of complaints about my property, and the responsibility of property owners to their neighbors. She held her clipboard at her side like she was presenting evidence, though she never produced a document. When she sat down, Margaret thanked her and asked if the property owner wished to address the board. I stood up. I did not say much. I walked to the table at the front of the room and placed the documents in a row. The original permit, March 14th, 2007. The covenant recording document, August 3rd, 2018. The sworn statement from Dale Ostroff. The sworn statement from Carol Fenwick. Then I set the certified copy of the Mill Street deed on top of the stack, with the recorded owner's name, my name, on the first page. Margaret Aldis picked up each document in order. She spent a moment on the permit and the covenant date. She spent longer on the two sworn statements. When she reached the Mill Street deed and read the address on the first line, she paused. She looked up at me, then looked at the address again, then looked slowly around the room in a way that did not require any narration from me. She did not look at Diane. She set the deed down and asked the city attorney, Frank Healy, to confirm the permit issuance date and the covenant recording date from the documents in front of him. Frank picked up both papers. He read the permit date aloud, March 14th, 2007. He read the covenant recording date, August 3rd, 2018. Margaret asked him whether the association's covenants applied to a property that had been deeded prior to the August 2018 recording date and whose owner had not signed onto the covenants. Frank said they did not. Margaret then asked him to examine the two sworn statements regarding the complaint affidavit. Frank read both statements. His expression did not shift, but he set them down with a deliberateness that said something all by itself. And he told the board, in a flat, careful voice, that the affidavit underlying the demolition order appeared to contain signatures that the named parties denied providing, and that this would require referral to the prosecutor's office. Margaret nodded once. She asked for a motion to rescind the demolition order on the grounds that the jurisdictional predicate and the supporting affidavit were both defective. A council member to her left made the motion immediately. It was seconded. Margaret called the vote. 5-0. Order rescinded. The entire exchange, from the moment I placed the first document on the table to the final vote, took 19 minutes. Diane stood up from the second row. Her voice had an edge in it that was trying to sound like authority and landing closer to alarm. She said the process had been followed correctly, that the complaint affidavit had come through proper channels, that the board was overstepping by rescinding without a full evidentiary hearing. Margaret looked at her from the dais with an expression that held nothing hostile and nothing sympathetic, just the flat attention of someone who has already heard the answer and does not need to hear the question again. Margaret said the jurisdictional record was clear. The affidavit presented credibility issues that required separate referral, and the item was closed. She called the next agenda matter. Diane sat down. Court had not spoken once the entire evening. He had not shifted in his chair when the permit dates were read. He had not looked at the Mill Street deed when Margaret read the address aloud. He had a particular kind of stillness that was not calm. It was the stillness of a man who has just understood something and is choosing not to react to it in public. The room had gone quiet the way rooms do when an outcome that seemed already decided has been turned over and shown to be something else entirely. Beth set her hand on my forearm briefly and then took it away. I picked up my documents, slid them back into the binder, and sat down in the front row and waited for the rest of the meeting to conclude. The 30-day lease termination notices for the Mill Street Suites went out the following morning by certified mail. I addressed them to the Hollis Bend Neighborhood Association and to Wexler Property Group separately, per their separate lease agreements. Both leases were month-to-month with no renewal provision, and both tenants had received standard 30-day notice in writing. Neither had the legal right to contest the termination. The HOA board called an emergency session 6 days after the council meeting and voted, 9-2, to remove Diane Wexler from the presidency. The board issued a written statement acknowledging that the complaint filings against my property had been in error, that my workshop predated and fell outside the association's jurisdiction, and that the board had not been fully informed of the circumstances before the filings were made. The county prosecutor's office opened a formal inquiry into the forged affidavit. Court Wexler's Connector Road project required, at the critical bend in its route, a 14-foot strip of right-of-way running along my south fence line. Without it, the geometry of his planned condo access road did not resolve. The development permit application went into suspension. 3 months after the council meeting, Wexler Property Group withdrew its preliminary site plan entirely from the county planning queue. I drove home from City Hall that night with Mara in the passenger seat of my truck. The roads were empty, and the river was up after a week of rain. And we could see the water high in the fields alongside the highway, dark and flat and reflecting the headlights of oncoming trucks. Mara had her spiral notebook open on her knee for the first part of the drive, writing something I did not ask about. And then she closed it and set it in the footwell. We turned onto Sycamore Lane, and I swung into the driveway, and the headlights swept across the backyard. The workshop caught the light for a moment before I switched the engine off. The cedar siding had weathered to a warm gray over 17 years, but the trim boards along the roofline were still the color Doreen had picked, a dark stain she called tobacco, and they held. Mara sat looking at it through the windshield for a few seconds. Then she said, "Mom would have had that binder organized differently." I told her that was almost certainly true, and we went inside. Here's what I want you to take from this. The morning Diane's first letter arrived, I already had everything I needed to end it. I had a permit dated 11 years before her covenants were ever recorded. I had a deed that predated her jurisdiction. I did not know that with certainty until I looked, and I was not going to write a single check until I did. So the first thing I want to say to you is this. Go find your documents. Find your permit. Find your deed. Pull the county recorder's filing date on any covenant or association document that claims authority over your property, and set that date next to the date your deed was recorded. One of those dates is older, and the older one is what governs. The second thing is to document from the first contact, not from the second letter or the lawsuit or the moment you realize something serious is happening. From the first contact. Name, date, what was said, who delivered it, who witnessed it. You do not need an attorney on day one. You need a folder and the habit of opening it. The third thing is harder to say plainly without it sounding like advice I planned in advance, so I will say it the way it actually was. Know the ground you are standing on, and know who owns the ground the people threatening you are standing on. I did not buy that Mill Street parcel as a weapon. I bought it because Doreen's uncle offered it to me at a fair price, because I had known that block for 20 years, and because the numbers worked. The use revealed itself when the time came. Keep your record straight, verify the dates, and be patient enough to let the documents do the talking. That is the whole lesson. If you have ever faced your own version of this, a letter with a number in it, a fine that had no legal basis, a deadline somebody invented for you, drop it in the comments. I read them. And if this story kept you company for a while, a subscribe means the next one reaches you when it goes up. Next time, a Navy veteran finds out the association had been collecting dues on his lot for 6 years on a parcel they never legally annexed into the association. Until then, take care of your deeds.